morning, everybody. It's great to be with you today, and hopefully we can answer some of your questions. I was asked to speak about whether South Africa could lift its growth rate, elevate its growth rate to higher levels over the next couple of years. I think the first point, if we go to our first slide there, is that clearly that is what's lacking from the South African economic landscape. We need to accelerate economic growth dramatically. That first graph really shows you South Africa's GDP. It shows you GDP from 1994. And you can see for a long time we were moving in the right direction, especially during the 90s. Then came the global financial crisis. We had a change in political administration to that of Jacob Zuma. And we all know what went wrong over that period. It is very familiar to all of us. But that is really when our growth rate started to slow. We gradually lost momentum, and really the economy entered a period of prolonged stagnation. The pandemic made everything a lot worse. We took a very sharp dip during the pandemic. We got back to pre-pandemic levels, but growth since then has been very slow. It's been very patchy. It's been very uneven. And really, we have failed to move that red line, which is really the rand value of our goods and services produced in South Africa to a higher ground, which is absolutely essential if we hope to address that second graph, which is unemployment. To deal with South Africa's biggest problems, and if you think of our biggest problems, it remains, high levels of unemployment among the highest in the world, high levels of inequality, and pervasive poverty. And the key to that is job creation. And if you look at unemployment, even though we've done a little bit better in the last couple of years after the pandemic has ended, we're still in a situation where we haven't managed to reduce the number of unemployed back to pre-pandemic levels and even further below, and really deal with what is a very significant unemployment problem, which of course have all sorts of ripple effects into a burden on the fiscus, social instability, and really just the sadness of it all, that there is really unutilized labor that is lying idle in the background. And so that is our challenge. And in order to get there, faster economic growth is absolutely essential. If you go to the next slide, the key really for us is to address the very factors that contributed to our economic stagnation over the past 15 years. They are well understood. They are well documented. Both domestically and international scholars have given us a very good sense of what we need to deal with. Our essential problem here is that we've got very significant supply side constraints. Most of them is just inefficient critical economic infrastructure. And that ranges, of course, from electricity, but also to logistics. Your road, rail, and port infrastructure is both inadequate and inefficient. In other words, they are expensive and unreliable. And we need to address that, especially for a country like South Africa, where we are a commodity producer and exporter. Commodities are producers are price takers. They therefore can only control the cost. That is what their ability to control the cost is what determines their ability to compete internationally and to make profits and to prosper. And that logistics is a very big portion of that. Electricity is a very big portion of that. And for too many South African companies, there is an enormous component of their cost that they simply cannot control. And that relates to these infrastructure constraints we have. And so we know we need to solve the electricity shortage. We know we need to improve logistics. We are far from our main markets, and in order to compete, we need more efficient logistics and energy infrastructure. And these graphs really show our progress towards that front. For a very long time, we spoke about dealing with these things. Almost over a decade, from 2018, when President Ramaphosa, when the initial programs for energy reform were announced, it was also very slow going, but eventually we got to a point now especially in the last couple of months, where we've seen some of these reforms starting to yield results. The most significant improvement has been in energy supply. That is where we have seen the most significant gains. If you look at that first slide, that shows you Eskom's electricity availability factor. Eskom suspended load shedding from the 26th of March. And part of the reason why they've been able to do that is because the economy isn't growing very fast. Up until the second half of this year, we've been growing at a rate of 0.5%. So there's been less demand for electricity and therefore less pressure on the power grid. However, Eskom did manage to improve its performance. And so what you see there is Eskom's electricity availability factor. They've managed to lift it to a higher level, so that's helped, and that's contributed to the situation where we've now had no load shedding since the 26th of March. It's not the only factor that has contributed. Part of the energy reforms was to unleash and enable the private sector to undertake private generation and supply that to the grid. And we have seen a significant increase in electricity generation coming from independent power producers. That's also contributed and added more capacity to the system. And then another factor that's contributed is the incentives that were provided to businesses and households to essentially put in rooftop solar, batteries and inverters, and really effectively move off the grid. And with them now no longer having to use grid power, that's also reduced the pressure on the grid. Have we solved the electricity crisis? No. If we are growing at 0.5%, clearly we can operate without load shedding. That in and of itself, of course, helps. But ultimately, if we want to grow by 2%, 3%, 4%, which is what we are looking at in today's topic, we need to increase electricity generation much more dramatically. So we need to accelerate renewable energy generation. We need to accelerate the involvement of the private sector in energy generation. And another major obstacle is that we need to aggressively and rapidly expand the electricity grid. So that's a key step to unlocking faster growth in the years to come. Then we need to deal with our generally inefficient logistics. So if we just look at the ports, you've got two slides there, one looking at tonnage handled at the ports. That would mainly be mining exports. So this is all the ferromanganese, the coal, everything being processed primarily at Richards Bay and Saldanha. And if we then look at the next one, which is container traffic, that would now be Durban, Cape Town, and all the other ports, where we are looking at the processing of containers at the ports. Now, here, we've had marginal improvements from very low levels in late 2022 and early 2023, but we are still very far from calling our port operations efficient. Now, here too, reforms are in process to bring private operators into the ports. This has had mixed success. It's been a slow process, so we're very far from actually saying we've got efficient ports. So still a long road to go there. When we look at the mix between road and rail infrastructure, too many goods, even goods that are best transported by rail, are moving by road. So we've seen a slight improvement in the freight moving through rail, also from its lowest level, but we're still miles below its peak. And the improvement is already starting to lose some upward traction. So even there, we've got to press ahead, we've got to accelerate it, we've got to move it forward. So we're making progress. And the biggest change really has been on the structural front. The key to all of this, if we go to the next slide, is really about unlocking and accelerating infrastructure investment. That is what's needed. And if we can unlock faster infrastructure investment, put efficient infrastructure in place, we will also make it possible for the private sector to expand their operations more aggressively. One of the biggest reasons why South Africa has entered this prolonged period of economic stagnation relates to that first graph you see there, which is gross fixed capital formation. We have insufficient levels of gross fixed capital formations. We know that across the globe, countries that tend to outperform, where economic growth accelerates very rapidly, employment creation accelerates rapidly, and wealth creation accelerates rapidly. They have high levels of fixed investment. In South Africa, we've gone the opposite way. Gross fixed capital formation, which is total fixed investment, has deteriorated dramatically since 2010. And you can see that as its share of GDP, it has declined to very low levels. We've had a slight improvement post the pandemic, but coming off desperately low levels, and we're still miles away from pre-pandemic levels in terms of fixed investment. So we need higher fixed investment, and the key here is infrastructure spending. If you look at that second graph, it essentially shows you the share of private sector fixed investment relative to GDP, and also of the public sector fixed investment relative to GDP. And the public sector can be broken down further between state-owned enterprises and general government. And you can see the reason for the implosion in fixed investment. Very, very low levels of capital expenditure by SOEs and the public sector. And unfortunately, this is the part of the economy that really determines the quality of infrastructure, of general economic infrastructure in the economy. So we need the public sector to come to the party to accelerate infrastructure delivery. Now, in this regard, it is clear that government has capacity issues in delivering on capital expenditure and on infrastructure. And part of the argument might be to draw in a far greater share through some innovation, through innovative financing, through innovative project management, to get the private sector more involved in delivering some of this critical infrastructure. Private-public partnerships is probably the answer to South Africa's structural constraints going forward. So government's already moving in that direction, but not fast enough to deal with the infrastructure issue. If government can deliver that infrastructure, it can lift the constraint on the private sector, making it a lot easier for the private sector to expand its operations. Now, here's the key and why fixed investment is so important. If you don't have higher levels of fixed investment, think of it from a private company's perspective. If they do not expand their operations, what good reason would they have to employ more staff? And so fixed investment is the key to higher job creation, ultimately at the end of the day. So this is what we need to address. If we go to the next slide, that's kind of our assessment of where we stand at the moment. So to answer your question, will we be able to see growth of 3 to 4% over the next 2 years? It seems highly unlikely because structural problems cannot be solved by just cutting interest rates and relying and allowing demand to accelerate. Structural problems require time. It takes a long time to put in more rail infrastructure. It takes a long time to put in more road infrastructure. It doesn't take that long to put in renewable energy, but it is still a process that at least runs over a period of 12 to 18 months. So because of this, there is no quick fix to South Africa's growth problem. We have to eke out these structural changes and slowly ease these supply-side constraints on the economy. At least we are starting to move in the right direction. And here I give you my summary or our summary of those of where we are at the moment. We've seen a significant improvement in electricity supply, and we believe we will see further gains on that front. We have made slight improvements in transport bottlenecks, water supply remain a concern, crime and corruption remain a concern, municipal services remain a concern. Government is slowly returning us to fiscal prudence, which have translated into a lower risk premium and lower political risk being priced into South African assets. And that's one of the big factors contributing to a firmer rand. And so as we are slowly making gains, just the little improvement we've seen, where the most spectacular element really has been greater stability in electricity supply, just that alone according to the Reserve Bank, will unlock faster potential growth. There's the Reserve Bank's estimates of potential growth, which shows you that we go from a very weak level of only 0.1% last year to much higher levels, although still very modest, of 1.2, 1.3, and 1.7% over the next 3 years. So to answer the question, we'll do a little bit better in the years ahead, but to unlock even faster growth, we do have to accelerate these structural reforms, especially in those critical areas we're listing on this graph. And if we can just bring electricity and logistics to the equation and get that functioning in a much more smoother and reliable manner, then we can probably move closer to 2% and slightly over 2% over the next 3 years. But to get to growth rates of 3 to 4%, that is going to be a bit of a push, simply because structural reforms take time. Thank you very much.